Okay, everybody. Um, so let's talk about it. When I think about what makes a great teacher, I think about someone who has all the answers. Someone like our Pastor Mike. So fill in the blank. You probably have somebody else in mind from your church. You know, somebody when you ask them a question, you get a response. It feels like straight out of a Wikipedia or a commentary. It's just like they know all the answers. It's like, how do they do that? So again, when I think what makes a great teacher, I'm thinking this guy knows this guy knows this. They're right on top of this thing. So when we think about Jesus as the greatest teacher of all time, you'd think he'd be the one with all the answers. And he certainly knew all the answers. I mean, he is God. He knows everything. But a lot of his teaching involves asking questions. And don't get me wrong, obviously he taught a lot. He gave commandments, he explained life, he told us about God. Um, but in this study, we're going to be looking at how he taught, not by statements that he made, didactic statements, but more about searching questions that he offered to people. So the goal of this class is not just information. It's not just, let me just understand this question. And now I can kind of go, got it. Jesus asked questions. I understand that now. No, the goal is to uh, take these questions and allow them to transform our faith, just like they transformed the faith of those around Jesus. And the only way to do that, it's going to be uncomfortable. The only way to be transformed and to grow in to what these questions are talking about is to ask yourself the questions that Jesus is asking. In some ways, to hear Jesus ask you that question, and for you to pause, to ponder, to think, and to go after the truth, kind of like a good counselor asks a question, and he makes you confront your beliefs. So that's my contention, is that's why Jesus asked many of his questions. I'm not say all of them, but many of his questions. They went to challenge his people. So again, sharing this book, the book that I got started thinking about this is the one on the left there. The question, Jesus is the question, subtitled "The 307 Questions Jesus Asked and the Three He Answered." Later on, he's going to say that Jesus answered 8. Um, I didn't do a definitive count. I've heard definitely over 300 from other people. This is the book that kind of got me started thinking about this, probably, I don't know, 2 years ago or something like that. Um, it's not essential for sure. Don't feel like you need to buy this book. Uh, in fact, um, it's not that I wouldn't recommend it. There's lots of stories, lots of, I'm going to say, not fluff, but it's more of a devotional book. Um, so if you want to buy that eventually, that's fine, or during the study, you can as well. The one next to it, the questions of Jesus, I used some of that. Honestly, it hasn't been all that helpful. It's even more fluffy than the other one. Um, but those are the two books. That I'm going to, so I'll be mentioning especially the Copenhagen book a couple times. So I just wanted to make sure that you saw that. As an introduction, let's think about how often Jesus asked questions. So this might come as a surprise, but think about how often Jesus asked questions. And you're going to need a Bible. So grab a Bible or open up an app. You could pretend like you have a Bible in front of you. I won't know, but have a Bible open so we can look at that together. And think about the first time we see Jesus in the Gospels after his birth. Remember that? What was the first time we saw Jesus? Does anyone want to hazard a guess again. This is after his birth. What was the setting that we see Jesus? This is so awkward. Okay, I'm going to just give you the answer because I'm thinking we're probably all thinking it and just don't want to jump in. Jesus is 12 years old. If you remember, what's he doing? Yeah. Okay. I think we got the answer. Yeah. So Jesus is 12 years old, right? He's in Jerusalem. And if you remember, this was the original Home Alone movie, right? His parents leave him, and they find out a couple days later that indeed they have left him in Jerusalem. And in Luke 2, so go ahead and turn to that. Luke 2:46. And I've got everyone muted again, if that's okay. Luke 2:46. I'll go ahead and read this, but follow along. 2:46 says, after 3 days, the parents, found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking questions. And I find that pretty amazing. Here, Jesus is 12 years old. What is that? 7th grade, something like that, asking questions to the experts in the religion, in the Jewish religion. How hard is it for those teachers among us to ask a good question? You have to know a lot to ask a good question. And here was Jesus at 12 years old asking questions to the religious leaders. In verse 47, it says, everyone who heard was amazed at his understanding and his answers. So let's keep reading 48 and 49. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. Here are the first words we hear Jesus say. Why were you searching for me? A question. Yes, didn't you know I had to be about my father's house? First question, first words of Jesus. Question. What was the last thing Jesus said on earth, at least in the Gospel of Matthew? It's my God, why have you forsaken me? He begins with a question. He ends with a question. We're going to find in our study tonight that the first thing he says to his disciples was in the form of a question. You would think, you'd think that after his resurrection, he would finally give his disciples the answers, right? It'd be like, okay, guys, let's get together. I know I've asked you a lot of questions, like 307 of them, right? But throughout my life, and you really haven't understood. You've missed most of it. So let me now just kind of give you all the answers, and I'm just going to lay them all out. And honestly, maybe he did. We don't know. We only hear about from the Gospels that he asked these questions. What are you talking about as you walk along? Or do you have anything to eat? Or do you love me? How about that for a question to Peter? Do you love me? We're going to look at that later too. Some of his questions are rhetorical. He didn't expect an answer like right off the bat. Like for instance, who of you by worrying can add a single hour to his life? It's not like someone could get up and say, hey, me, the other day I worried and I think I gained 3 hours. The idea, these are rhetorical questions that force people to think and to question the whole idea of worry. And that's going to be, I think it's next week or next 2 weeks. Some of his questions, many of his questions directly challenge the listener. And I think for us, the reader, as we read these questions, like, where is your faith? Or, this is a toughie, why could you not watch with me 1 hour? Talk about directly challenging his followers. He asks seemingly silly questions to the blind man. Remember what he said? What do you want me to do for you? Does that seem silly? I mean, duh, I want to see, right? Actually, that question shows a lot of respect for that man. You think about if you went up to a homeless person and we assume we know what they want. We assume that they want some money from us. But maybe if you asked that homeless man, if you said, what do you want? Maybe they would say, boy, I would love a hot meal. I would love a job. I'd love a friend. I'd love to get out of this lifestyle. Maybe they want money, probably. But what I'm saying is, Jesus was showing a lot of respect for the blind man by saying, is this something that you want? Do you want this? Do you have the faith to allow this to happen? Um, let's be honest. The teaching of Jesus can be frustrating. Can we be honest about that? He's teaching from a different point of view than we're coming at. We want bullet points. We want, okay, I'm going to say I want a to-do list. I want instructions. But Jesus, he doesn't give us spiritual tips. He doesn't give us a top 10 ways to feel closer to God. He didn't write, a blog about how to feel closer to God every day. Instead, he asked these hard questions that force his listeners to think. One way to think about it is think about the Apostle Paul. Compare him to Jesus, the difference in their teaching. You think about Paul as he writes Romans, and he gives us this argument that is just unassailable, just amazing. And you think about Jesus, who asked these questions. If you want to think about Paul maybe having like a Western mindset, and maybe Jesus having more of an Eastern mindset, if you take my drift on that. This tradition of asking questions definitely comes out of the Jewish background of Jesus. In fact, the joke is, why does a Jew answer a question with a question? Answer? Well, why shouldn't a Jew answer a question with a question? Are you laughing? Some of you are laughing. Okay. But that's what we've got here. It's a very, I'm going to say, if I could say, a Jewish thing, rabbi thing to do, and Jesus enters into that. Like, for instance, the Passover Seder, that ceremony. If you're familiar with that, it's structured around questions. Like, for instance, why is this night different than any other night? So Jesus, as a good rabbi, ask these questions. And so tonight we're going to look at three. In subsequent weeks, we'll answer, obviously, look at other ones. But the first one is this question: what are you looking for? What are you looking for? Let's start by turning to John 1. John 1. And we're going to be, the story is 35 through 42. And I would love to have somebody read this passage for us. I'm going to pick on Steve, if you don't mind, Steve. Can you do 35 through 42, Steve?
John 1, 35 to 42 says, "The next day, John was there again with two of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, 'Look, the Lamb of God.' When the two disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, 'What do you want?' And they said, 'Rabbi,' which means teacher, 'where are you staying?' 'Come,' he replied, 'and you will see.' So they went and saw where he was staying, and they spent that day with him. It was about 4 p.m. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the two who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, 'We have found the Messiah, that is the Christ.' And he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, 'You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas,' which, when translated, is Peter."
Thank you, Steve. So the Gospel of John doesn't give a very detailed account of the calling of the disciples. Other Gospels do. Here we see two disciples being called. Andrew's one. I'm not sure about the identity of the other. They had been disciples of John, but then when John gave his endorsement to Jesus, they follow Jesus. And so Jesus asked a seemingly simple question: what do you want? Or maybe your translation would say, what are you seeking? What are you looking for? They deflect the question. They ask him where you're staying. By the end of the day, Andrew was convinced that Jesus is the Messiah, which I find pretty amazing. He's just convinced. We found him. So maybe the best sense of Jesus' question is, what are you looking for in life? You're obviously seekers. I mean, you're following John. Um, and he asks them, now, what are you looking for? And based on their joyous response, I think the answer is, we're looking for the Messiah, someone to satisfy all of our longings. Now, as we seek to answer that question, as we hear Jesus asking that question, or we ask that question to ourselves, the context is really important. For instance, if I stand in front of the refrigerator, have it open, and my wife asks, "What are you looking for?" Right? That's not a very profound question. Trying to decide between yogurt, not going to be vegetables, maybe a piece of fruit or eggs, or whatever it is in the refrigerator. But if you've lost your job and you're pondering your future, and then you ask this question, what are you looking for? Well, that's more profound. Um, a story that Martin Copenhaver tells, he tells about the Quaker practice called the Clearness Committee. Basically, someone comes to this committee with an issue, and the committee just asks questions. They don't give them any advice. They just ask open-ended questions. So this guy named Parker comes, and he says, well, his issue is, the Clearness Committee says, what would you like? What do you need help with? And Parker says, well, I'm trying to decide if I want to take this position as president of a college. Now, he'd been a teacher, and then he'd been offered this presidency of this small college. And so someone from the committee asked Parker, well, what would you like most about being president? And Parker answered, well, I would really miss writing, and my students, I really miss the teaching. I I really don't like like the politics of being president, and I'd hate to do fundraising, and I'd hate to give up my summer breaks. And the Clearness Committee responded, "Excuse me, may I remind you that we asked you what you would most like about being president?" After thinking some more, Parker replied, "Well, I guess what I'd like most is having my picture in the paper with the name President under it." To which the committee responded, "Parker, can you think of an easier way to get your picture in the paper?" The point is, many times we don't know what we're looking for, right? What we're longing for, what we're going after. So we live in a perpetual state of disappointment because we haven't found it yet. It's like that U2 song, I still haven't found what I'm looking for, right? He's never going to find it. Another example, like think about Christmas. Think about how often we go into Christmas with these great expectations, right? Maybe you really want to experience that feeling you had as a kid, experiencing Christmas. You remember that Christmas you were around family, it was warm, it was magical. You didn't know where the presents were coming. There was no Visa bills in January, no school, no pressure. And for some reason, you're having a hard time experiencing that Christmas, right? But that's the Christmas that you want. And every Christmas, you're disappointed because you can't have it. So obviously, what you want is impossible. So wouldn't it make sense to ask in that occasion, what am I looking for? And to realize what's realistic about this situation. Now, back to Jesus' question. What are you looking for? How would you answer that in your life? Like, think about it. What would most satisfy you? Now, this is not a question I'm going to unmute you all and get like your answer, right? Because chances are you'd be like, next person, please pass, because at the top of our head, we probably could not say, here is what I'm looking for. If this happened in my life, I would be totally satisfied. No, this is a question that you answer in silence. You answer it by pondering it. You answer it by inviting the Holy Spirit into your life and to speak into your kind of inner being and to look into your life. Because here's the deal, guys, that if we're wrong, if we answer that correct question incorrectly, and if we pursue something ultimately we don't want, right, like that guy Parker did, ultimately we're going to be frustrated because we're going to get something that ultimately we didn't want in the first place. Does that make sense? So how about you walk with God? What are you looking for when you walk with God? I'm going to share the screen again. I'm going to share a couple of verses here with you that I'm going to read. I think that's going to be the easiest way. I'll just read these and invite you just to be thinking about them slowly as I read them slowly. As the deer pants for flowing streams, so my soul longs for you, O God. You, God, are my God. Earnestly I seek you. I thirst for you. My whole being longs for you in a dry and parched land where there is no water. Back to the Gospels. You don't want to leave me too, do you? Jesus asked the 12. Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. That longing for God's presence, we get a taste of it this side of heaven. Listen to this taste. For he satisfies the thirsty and fills the hungry with good things. But I'm going to contend that we're not going to be fully satisfied until heaven, when the Spirit and the bride say, come, and let the one who hears say, come. Let the one who's thirsty come, and let the one who wishes take the free gift of the water of life. It reminds me of that God-shaped vacuum that Pascal talked about. Only God can fill it. So I encourage you this week to ask that question in God's presence. As you pray, what am I looking for? Now, as I was preparing for this, we're doing this thing called a listening session. And so this basically what this is I send out this survey to people in our church and I say, hey, listen to these songs. Let me know what you think. So it's an online survey. People rate the songs from 1 to 10 and they give me comments about it. And so as soon as they do it online, because, it's online, I get the response right back and I can see who said what, which is kind of fun. Now, in this one particular case, a person sent this survey back, and let's just say the person was very negative. I don't think most of the requests were above. I'm sorry, most of the survey questions were above a 5. In the comments section, this person was pretty negative. And when I read it, I got to be honest with you, I was pretty hurt. I mean, I had spent months looking for these songs. I'd gone over them dozens of times. I had picked what I thought were the best 12 songs, 13 songs or whatever for our congregation. And when I read it, it really made me question the whole process. Maybe these are really bad songs. Maybe I have no idea what I'm doing. No one's going to like these songs. And I did this spiral down thing. Has anybody ever done that? Come on, everybody has done that, right? Where you start one place, spiral down. Marcia caught me, I think, mid-spiral there, right? And then I remembered this question. What are you looking for? And I said, Lord, what am I looking for in this survey? And based on here's what my answer was. And this is based on my emotional reaction to that person. I would have to say, here's what I was looking for based on my reaction to their survey. I'm looking for everyone to love these songs. I want everyone to rate them 9 or 10 for each one. I want them to write me a handwritten card saying how amazing each one of these songs were. I want them to include a Dairy Queen gift card and say, "Wow, you're amazing. I can't believe you're serving at this church." Now, I may be exaggerating a little bit, just a little, but the question forced me to think, what was I looking for? And what I realized, what I really wanted, I wanted honest responses. I wanted people to say, this song is terrible. I want to hear that before I actually try to teach it on a Sunday morning, right? So I ended up spiraling back up, right? And kind of going, boy, as hard as that survey was, thank you for that survey, right? Because that's what I was looking for. I'm glad they weren't all like that, but that's the power of that question in your life. So here's a suggestion. The next 2 weeks, if you come to a situation maybe where you're disappointed, where you're hurt, you have this emotional reaction, maybe it's anger, and you're just going, wow, where did that come from? I mean, that just seems like out of proportion to the situation. Maybe you can ask this question: what am I looking for? Was my expectation realistic? And the answer is probably no, right? Because your reaction was, I'm going to say, unrealistic or wrong. So what are you looking for? That's the first one. I see someone put down, so much of it depends on how we define success. Absolutely. What am I looking for goes hand in hand with where am I looking? Yep. That could absolutely be, where are we looking for God's blessing? What am I looking for? What does success mean? And if we define it more and more with those verses that we looked at a moment ago, I think we're going to be much more likely to be content with what comes our way. Okay, what are you looking for? I'm going to give a chance for anyone who wants to just make a quick comment. They can. I know the awkwardness of Zoom meetings, but if you want to unmute yourself and say something, I'm going to take a drink of water and then hang out. Okay. Moving on. Next question. Do you see? Do you see? Let's look up Luke 7:36. 7:36. This is a little bit longer of a passage. I would love to read the whole thing, though. So, who feels like reading? Give me a hand. Give me indication.
Is that
okay.
John?
Luke 7:30.
Oh,
Luke,
sorry.
yeah.
Okay.
Dave, would you like to read this? Did I see your hand? Okay, go ahead and unmute yourself, David. Go ahead and unmute yourself. And do you want to read, David? David Paula? Yeah, Cahill?
Sure.
Yeah?
Yes.
Okay. So we're going to be
7:36 through what?
50. 36 through 50.
Well, that's so long, I won't volunteer now. I'm joking. Okay.
Thank you.
Luke 7:36. Now, one of the Pharisees was requesting him to dine with him, and he entered the Pharisee's house and reclined at the table. And behold, there was a woman in the city who was a sinner, and when she learned that he was reclining at the table in the Pharisee's house, she brought an alabaster vial of perfume. And standing behind him at his feet, weeping, she began to wet his feet with her tears, and kept wiping them with her hair of her head, anointing them with perfume.
Hey, David, we lost your audio there somehow.
I'm sorry. Now, when the Pharisee who had invited him saw this, he said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know who and what sort of person this woman is who is touching him, that she is a sinner. And Jesus answered and said to him, Simon, I have something to say to you. And he replied, Say it, teacher. A certain moneylender had two debtors. One owed 500 denarii and the other 50. When they were unable to repay, he graciously forgave them both. Which of them, therefore, will love him more? Simon answered and said, I suppose the one whom he forgave more. And he said to him, You have judged correctly. And turning toward the woman, he said to Simon, Do you see this woman? I entered your house. You gave me no water for my feet, but she has wet my feet with her tears and wiped them with her hair. You gave me no kiss, but she, since the time I came in, has not ceased to kiss my feet. You did not anoint my head and with oil, and she anointed my feet with perfume. For this reason I say to you, her sins, which are many, have been forgiven. For she loved much, but he who is forgiven little loves little. And he said to her, Your sins have been forgiven. And those who were reclining at the table with him began to say to themselves, Who is this man who even forgives sins? And he said to the woman, Your faith has saved you. Go in peace.
Thank you, David. So Luke says this woman had lived a sinful life, most likely a prostitute, and she stood behind Jesus, weeping, wet his feet with her tears, dried them with her hair, kissed his feet, poured perfume on them. Later, Jesus contrasted her actions with Simon, the Pharisee. No water for his feet, no kiss, no oil for his head, which would have been offered to a respected guest. And so he tells this parable. Figure a denarii is a day's wage for a laborer. So one owed him a lot, let's say about a year and a half of wages. The other owed a decent amount, maybe like a month and a half of wages. And he asked, and said both were forgiven. And the question is, which one loved him more? And you could just kind of hear Simon just being reluctant. He's like, well, I suppose the one who had the bigger debt forgiven is like, I don't know. I read it like dragging it out. I suppose. And then the question, do you see this woman? So what did Jesus mean by that question? I mean, he can't mean the obvious. Like, did your eyes see that there's a woman here? I mean, couldn't mean that, right? Rather, did you move beyond your stereotypes and preconceptions? See, Simon saw this woman and immediately labeled her a sinner. Jesus didn't see a stereotype. He saw an individual. He saw a woman. So Jesus was asking, do you see this person as an individual with a particular story? Yes, with a history. Yes, with problems, but one who's seeking God. To the religious leader, Jesus asked, do you see this woman as a daughter of Abraham, your sister in God's family? You know, you start to see, I'm thinking a little of the outrage of Jesus, of the, don't you see this woman? See that? Simon and the other Pharisees, they probably missed Jesus' whole point, because when he went ahead and forgave her sins, right? What happened? They're like, you can't do that. Who is he to forgive sins, right? So they probably missed the whole thing. And it's so easy for us to judge those Pharisees, right? They're such great targets. But for us, isn't it easy to dismiss people as stereotypes, right? It's much harder to dismiss a person. And how do we see people? Do we label them? Do we judge them by their past? Do we see only the surface? Do we kind of take some of their mistakes and say, yep, there's the sinner, right? Think about someone that you see often. Kind of have somebody in your mind's eye, maybe even. Maybe you don't know them that well. You see them. What if when you looked at them, what if when you looked at them, you heard Jesus ask, do you see this woman? Do you see this man? Let's make it easier. Let's say, let's pick somebody in your family, maybe someone who's sitting right next to you right now. Have you gotten so used to them that you fail to see them? Do you fail to see who they really are? Do you see them how Jesus sees them? So, how does Jesus see them? Because he saw that woman, he sees us, he sees every individual in a much different way than we see them. C.S. Lewis has this great quote. I'm going to put it up on the screen because it is so good. You might even be familiar with that. I'll read this to you. It's a serious thing to live in a society of possible gods and goddesses, to remember that the dullest and most uninteresting person you talk to may one day be a creature which, if you saw it now, you'd be strongly tempted to worship, or else a horror and a corruption such as you now meet, if at all, only in a nightmare. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortals. These are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, exploit, immortal horrors or everlasting splendors. Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses. Look over that quote just for a moment. I find it incredible. Okay, back with me. So how does God see us? Again, does he see us as a stereotype? Does he label us sinner, backslider, liar, unfaithful? No, the Bible says this, and I'm going to read this for you. The Bible says, we were made in God's image. God saw our unformed substance and knit us in our mother's womb. Jesus said we are more valuable than sparrows. While we were still sinners, Jesus died for us before we could even make ourselves right with God. As believers, Jesus has adopted us and calls us children of God. We're utterly secure. Jesus said that no one is able to snatch you out of my hand. We have the Spirit living inside us, guiding and teaching and convicting of sin. We're being transformed into the image of Jesus. And one day, we'll be like him, perfected and glorified, just like the C.S. Lewis quote. And in heaven, we'll dwell perfectly with God in his presence. That's how God sees us. And that's how Jesus saw the woman. I see a request for where did that C.S. Lewis quote come from? I can't remember. I'm sorry. Can't remember. Yeah. And someone else says there's nothing new under the sun. We can still look on the outside and not the value of the soul. Jesus looks into the heart and reaches to the soul. Boy, isn't that true? Isn't that true? Especially as we see people rioting, as we see racism still as a problem in our society. We just see at the very surface, and God sees all the way through. Boy, great comments, you guys. So that's how Jesus sees this woman, and he asks, do you see her like that? What a powerful question. Again, the Pharisees missed it. Let's not be like them. Again, look around at people tomorrow, put this into practice and ask yourself, do I see him Do I see her? And I think that's going to have a difference on how you treat that person. Okay. One more question that I'd like to go over. And this question is, why are you bothering her? That's a little strange out of context. Why are you bothering her? Is Jesus asking that question? Go to Mark 14, 3 through 9. Mark 14, 3 through 9. Looking for another volunteer to read.
I can read.
Who's that?
It's Bree. I can read.
Gotcha. See it now. Okay.
Okay, so Mark 14, 3 through 9, you said?
Yes.
And Mark 14 through 9. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly, and she broke the flask and poured it over her head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you always have the poor with you, and wherever you want, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her."
Thanks, Bree. Yeah, so a similar story than what we just read. There's enough details to believe that this is a different occasion. This person was most likely Mary, sister of Lazarus. We see in the parallel passage from John that she's identified there. And so we have this extravagant display of worship. I mean, anointing Jesus with perfume that cost like a year's wages. I mean, think about that. Think about how much you make, and think about in one act of worship, putting that out before Jesus' feet. I mean, it's stunning, stunning. Jesus, now, Jesus' disciples knew that he cared about the poor, talked about them all the time. So maybe they were kind of hoping to kind of score some points. And they're like, okay, well, this could have been sold and the money given to the poor, right, Jesus? Right? Do you kind of see that? Maybe kind of like, hey, I think we finally got, our concern for the poor, just like you do, Jesus. This could have been sold, right? And after all, this was impractical. It is wasteful. And Jesus must have just surprised them, must have just shocked them and said, why are you bothering her? I mean, what a question. Why are you bothering her? It's like he's saying, yes, I'm concerned with the poor, and you should be too. And there's going to be plenty of opportunity to help them. Believe me. Like he said, the poor you're going to always have with you. He is days away from his crucifixion, days away from his crucifixion. So he says, you will not always have me, literally. So the question I would ask based on Jesus' question is this: what impresses God? What makes God, what makes Jesus kind of go, wow, that really impresses me? What kind of worship is he pleased with? Let's turn to an Old Testament story that's related to this, and I'll kind of parallel them. So turn back to 2 Samuel chapter 6. Second Samuel chapter 6, and I'm going to start like in verse 5. King David's bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem, and he does it in a big way. So verse 5, David and all Israel were celebrating with all their might before the Lord, with castanets, harps, lyres, timbrels, sistrums, and cymbals. If you do not, if you don't prefer loud worship, this would not be the place for you, right? This was raucous. This was crazy. I don't know if they were playing it all in time. My guess is they were just like noise bangers. They were just banging things because they were just so excited. It makes me think, it made me ask my question, when was the last time I did something with all my might? I mean, this was loud, this was boisterous. They were doing with all their might. Go down to verse 13. Every 6 steps, David sacrificed 2 animals. So, and it was not only boisterous, but I mean, how long would it take to get to Jerusalem if you're taking a break every 6 steps? I mean, it's like, what? And then verse 16, as the ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, Michal, daughter of Saul, watched from a window, and when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. Again, here he is worshiping with all his might, and Michal despised him. Let's go ahead and compare David to Mary from our previous story. They only cared what the Lord thought. They didn't care what people thought. And what's the reaction? Michal despised David. And you see in verse 20 there, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, just dripping with sarcasm, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in view of the slave girls of his servants as any vulgar fellow would. Like, ugh. And David's response, I love this, I will become even more undignified than this. Someone needs to write a song about that. And I will be humiliated in my own eyes. You think this is bad? Huh, I'm going to do even worse, right? What's the response to Mary's extravagance, right? The disciples, this could have been sold for a year's wages. And Jesus says, why are you bothering her? And in fact, whenever the story of the gospel is told, her story, what she just did for me, is going to be told as well. That's like, wow, that's amazing. So it's like Jesus is asking, okay, disciples, how much perfume would be appropriate? Right? Obviously, a year's worth is too much, but an ounce, 5 ounces? Do I need to measure it out? Right? So my original question is, what impresses God? Think about it. What impresses God? Think about stories from Scripture. Think about Jesus looking at the widow's mite. All she had to live on was given to Jesus. Think about Jesus writing his letter to Laodicea and saying, you're lukewarm, neither hot or cold. I'm going to spit you out. Whenever you're tempted to criticize someone's act of worship or service, hear Jesus' question. Why are you bothering her? Because Jesus is impressed by it, right? That is incredible. Amazing. Yeah, someone just wrote, think about Cain versus Abel. Great example. Yeah. Why are you killing him? Right? That's just amazing. I was trying to decide if I wanted to share this. I think I'm going to share this. There's an incident from my college days, and it was just a momentary thing. It's one of those moments that is just stuck in my brain. I'm sure it didn't mean anything to anybody around me, but it's, again, to my shame, it's still stuck in my mind, where I acted like Michal and I acted like the disciples. There was a group of, I'm going to say, more charismatic worshipers in our school, Wheaton College, and I heard them over talking, and they're like, yeah, we're going to go crazy tonight. We're going to just get loud tonight. We're just going to, this kind of thing. And I remember thinking, man, that's ridiculous. I remember I don't remember saying anything. I just remember the look of contempt I gave them. Because honestly, that kind of thing scared me to death back then. Maybe it still does. But it was just this look of contempt. And I remember the main leader looking at me and kind of instantly kind of shutting down. And I just was convicted by that. I guess I'm still convicted by that 30 years later, right? That's our look, that's our reaction to something that we think is just overdone. It's too much. It's a year's wages. Give me a break, right? So, two questions that I just kind of want to leave you with. First of all, I still want you to think about what would it mean for you to worship or to serve with all your heart. That haunts me. I'm like, boy, when was the last time I worshiped God with all my heart and didn't really care about what other people thought? Because that's the thing that's what we've seen. We've seen that's the thing that impresses God, right? And are you tempted to criticize people for their acts of worship or their acts of service? Mary's act of worship prompted Judas to betray Jesus. I mean, it's like then Judas went out. I think he saw that and said, that's it. That is the last straw. So think about that contrast. Think about the contrast of Mary sacrificing a year's worth of wages, making Judas go out for 30 pieces of silver that he ultimately hung himself over. I mean, talk about your contrast. Okay, 3 questions down. I think we've got 304 to go. So everybody good? Keep going? I'm kidding. That's all I got for tonight. But I invite you to ask these questions and feel God asking them through you. Let me share this. So here's just some questions. Here's the questions restated. I'm going to jot them down. So when you're going through life, maybe trying to make a decision, maybe you've had like an emotional reaction that you're just kind of going, where did that come from? What are you looking for? And ultimately asking God, what should I be looking for? Maybe that's a good question. What should I be looking for, God? Make my desires your desires. As you interact with people this week, do you see this woman? Do you see this man? Can you see them like Jesus sees them? And if you're tempted to criticize someone's act of worship or service, feel Jesus being angry at you and asking the question, why are you bothering her? She's doing a beautiful thing. Okay, everybody got those? I also am attempting, it says up there that I have recorded this. If you know somebody who'd like it, or if you'd like a copy of this for whatever reason, I could see if I can get that to you. I have no idea how it works, but it's recording. So we've got a couple comments. Thank you for these. Worship the Lord with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. Great verse, Deuteronomy 6:5. So at what point can we disagree with someone's worship? Yeah. I think it's safe to say you're on shaky ground unless someone's like obviously doctrinally out to lunch. If they're worshiping Jesus and it's a biblical way, if they're just more enthusiastic than me, you're on shaky ground criticizing them. I think that's what we're seeing today. And it's easy to elevate ourselves to be God. That's right. That's where we're at for sure. Great, guys. Well, 2 weeks from now, we'll have another series of questions. So